Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Beyond COP29, Powering Our Future, hosted by the Beyond COP team at UNA Scotland. Before I pass the floor on to Josh, our moderator for today, I would like to welcome our speakers, who will hear from shortly, Professor Karishma Ansharam, Professor Oksana Wojciuk, and Natalie Jones. And I will now pass the floor to our moderator for today's event, Josh Oxby, who will also talk about his experience at COP29.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And thank you all for the opportunity and for joining us here today at Beyond COP29. This is one of the flagship initiatives at UN House Scotland that we run every year, and it is our reflections on what the outcomes of COP have been and what we as a collective body of young people and young change makers took away from the event and are looking towards COP30. So COP29, unlike COP28, which is very much the energy COP itself, where we had the announcement of the doubling of energy efficiency and the tripling of installed renewable capacity, COP29 this year was dubbed the finance COP. It's where we had our first new collective quantified goal, where we were looking at financing the energy transition and the climate transition itself. We had goals that are building upon previous targets of $100 billion pledged towards developing countries in 2009. However, this past year, we've seen that developing countries were adamant that they would require at least $1.3 trillion per year. Whilst at COP29, the ambition was a little bit less than this, when we were only able to raise $300 billion per year by 2035. So clearly there's a real dichotomy going on here versus what the needs of developing countries are versus what we in sort of the global north, the more developed sphere of the world have seen and have been able to actionize and actually take towards addressing these climate challenges. So this is going to be a central point of our discussion here today. We're going to be reflecting on how COP28 and COP29 have been merging and combining the two elements of funding finance with this energy transition and what this is really meaning ahead of COP30 coming up at the tail end of this year. So in terms of this, I would now like to pass over to our first speaker here, Professor Karishma, who is a lecturer in climate finance and investment with the University of Edinburgh, with a research focus on enhancing access to climate finance for the local community. She's also the finance lead for Scotland Beyond Net Zero, and she brings a wealth of experience on IFI reforms and climate policy through her former roles with the International Climate Politics Hub and the UN High-Level Champions. She's been a research fellow on NDC financing in Africa and in Kenya at the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management in Germany, and she actively participates as an observer for the UNFCCC climate finance negotiations at COP, previously through Youngo and now through Ringo, the research constituency. Ringo, Karishma, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you for the generous introduction. But just want to say that in this space today, we are all here with the same mindset of, I would say, getting or making better place, and also for the climate and environment. And you started with a punchy line about what happened at COP and how we were disappointed with the climate goals, especially related to climate finance, because last year COP29 was a climate finance COP, as you might know. But we haven't lost hope yet, because as you might have heard, I would be happy also, since we are a very small group, to make it like a conversation with you as well. Hopefully to stick to my 10 minutes slot. So, and also I would be happy to drop some links for further readings on things that I would be mentioning. So we have not lost hope so far, because we agreed on a 300 billion target that was very much less than the 1.3 trillion. But have you heard that COP30 would have a special initiative or a roadmap that is called Baku to Belém, 1.3 trillion. So that's something that COP30 is looking into, though there has not been much buzz about how these consultations would look like. So this roadmap would would eventually look at how to mobilize that 1.3 trillion that everyone wants to see, mainly through grants, concessional finance, or non-debt creating instruments. I think that's the heart of advocacy and discussions at COP as well, because while mobilizing finance, we don't want instruments to be creating more debt. So non-debt creating is also very at heart of these advocacy agenda. And also, in doing this roadmap of 1.3 trillion, we are calling for inclusive consultations, whether it comes from the both teams of presidencies. So the incoming one from COP30 and the outgoing COP29 needs to commit to an open and transparent way that they would collect consultations, inputs, etc., both from Global North and Global South representative on how this 1.3 trillion would look like. Why am I also emphasizing on inclusive consultations? Because I was in the room last year at COP29 where the amount was being discussed in the press conference of LDCs, least developing countries, African group of negotiators, and so on. And everyone would say that, oh, we are calling for trillions, right? Or we won't agree on billions. And at the end of the day, we realized that even like the Global South or the most vulnerable negotiators group did not have many say, and they had to accept the 300 billion. So we have to have some more inclusiveness, more equality in those discussions. And it goes beyond just having a number of the table, right? And that would also be relevant to how energy access is being also financed through those projects, because we've seen that adaptation or loss and damage has had little attention in the previous goals. So while deciding on the number of new quantified goals, the NCQG, we were also advocating, like a lot of discussion was that it cannot just be a number. It has to be how this finance is being decentralized or channeled through different instruments or different communities and so on, right? So we need to foster this conversation again when we are talking about the trillions. It's just not about mobilizing the trillions, but how do we get and make good use of that trillions that would be there? So it goes to the most needed communities and it goes to projects as well that would make sense. And I would also want to put forward the aspect which goes beyond a bit COP, but mostly in practice about what's happening. There is a new trend or more practical projects coming into place, which is called blended finance. I would touch upon it very quickly. So blended finance is initiatives or financial products that would be put on the market to mobilize private finance. Like you see, for energy solutions to be viable, especially in the global south, it's really hard. Why would a private sector go in the global south and invest into those countries, right? Where they have high risk, a high geographical risk, high political risk. Sometimes the projects are not viable. They might not get the return as it is. If I tell you today to invest your savings, investment into the global south, would you readily do so? Yes or no? Would you just go and put your money there? So the financial viability is missing in those regions. That comes also for energy projects, right? So this is where blended finance is at heart of these improving access to finance and also allowing private sector to go there. So what does blended finance does? It's like a carrot and stick situation. So blended finance usually it provides concessional public funds. It can take different forms where it layers and provides different types of capital and a type of assurance for the private sector to come in. Some type of blended finance would be whether, the public finance, the MDBs, so multilateral development banks, governments can enhance technical capacities in the global south. So they make the projects more viable. They ensure that projects would gain return. Very good projects are being put on the market so that private sector can come in. So that's technical assistance. They help, project developers to write the proposals, develop the proposals, and so on. A second way is that to provide guarantees. So public sector can come in and say, okay, if anything happened, you incur loss, I would cover up your loss, and so on. So private investors, they would be more likely to come in, right? So that's the second type of example of blended finance. And there are numerous forms of blended finance that can take into place. I would drop the link of good examples and ongoing work on blended finance, but that's one way, one avenue that can be explored as well when it comes to mobilizing the finance, right? And then last one would be just energy transition, which is also one of my favorite topic. I would say when we are talking about policy, also finance, and also we have this social aspect into it, we cannot leave anyone behind when we are doing the energy transition, right? So just energy transition are very good examples to have a look at, and also to build further such kind of finance models. One good example that I was having a look when I was teaching last semester was the South African Just Energy Transition Partnerships, where they have granular plans for every sector. It was quite impressive how they have put plans for every sector on how they are decarbonizing, how they are having a more inclusion, more social impact, and also they have clear demands on the finance that they need over there. So I would say 3 points to have a look at from my intervention today, which I would be happy to drop some links in the chat, would be we go beyond a number when it comes to finance. We just don't talk about numbers, but there are many more aspects and factors to consider beyond numbers when we go to COP or we are having a policy discussion. And second would be, how do we entice private sector to come on board? Because as I mentioned, if today I ask you to go and invest your money, you would probably do so, right? So we can't just make noise about private sector. We have to create an enabling an environment for them through blended finance. And second would be good example of just energy transition partnerships that has been going on. I hope I was within my time, Josh, but happy to have a conversation later on. Thank you.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much, Krishna. I'm particularly interested about picking your brains later on about the Baku to Belém roadmap as well. You know, particularly interesting here as well, talking about policy and financial de-risking as well, which is going to be a crucial factor that will come into play, especially at COP30. And as we're seeing in how we're able to mobilize funds in the Global South right now, it's one of these key enablers that we're seeing. So really interested to talk to you more about this as well. We'll now hear from Professor Oksana. Her scientific interests concentrate on the analysis of the European Union's energy policy and diplomacy, resource security, and international relations in the context of global critical minerals supply chains. Oksana, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much for invitation, for opportunity, and today I would like to share with you some my thoughts, also which is part of my research about the post-war reconstruction in Ukraine in energy sector, and also last time Ukraine found in the center of geopolitical events, and not only in the terms of war but also about critical minerals. So I would like to share with you also some thoughts about this. Do you see my presentation?
Yes, crystal clear.
Okay, so I will try to, in very short way, to introduce you energy potential of Ukraine and also potential of critical minerals, and to introduce some perspectives and scenarios which could be developed after war. So as for Ukraine, Ukraine had made decarbonization a key of priority before the full-scale invasion of Russia to Ukraine. And when Volodymyr Zelensky became a president, so his policy was very very active in the field of renewable energy sources, and during his 2 years of rules, so renewable energy sources really were developing, especially in the territories which most of all today are occupied. Also, as for Ukraine still remains heavily reliant on fossil fuels with energy sector, and also emit a lot of greenhouse emissions, and that's why the new energy strategy, which was recommended for the realization before the full-scale invasion on Ukraine, meet positive reaction in the society, and Ukraine began to develop in this field, especially taking into the consideration that in 2014, when was annexation of Crimea, Ukraine has lost some deposits on the shelf of the Black Sea, so that's why this strategy was very important. So here you could see a map and some part of the occupied territories after the 2022, and you could see that most of the territories which are occupied today, they are very important in the field of energy security, because these territories have access to the Azov and Black Sea. And in general, when we look at the map of Ukraine, we could divide it on the east and west. On the river Dnieper, you could see it in the center. So the eastern Ukraine was always rich in the different kinds of mineral resources, and before the war were great plans, for example, for extracting shale gas, and even Chevron and ExxonMobil signed an agreement with Ukraine. But situation which was in Ukraine and the tension which were around Ukraine, especially last year, caused that these agreements were not realized, because these companies decided to leave Ukraine because of the security. As for primary consumption of Ukraine in 2024, you could see that in the balance of Ukraine dominate gas, still coal, oil, and nuclear energy. And when we look at the renewables, it is a small percent, but when we look at the every kind of renewable energy sources and compare it, for example, with the numbers before the presidency of Volodymyr Zelensky, so we can see that they were really growing in the last years. It is also was caused by the occupation of eastern Ukraine, Donbass, because Ukraine so much relied on the coal, anthracite. It was one of the main resources in the energy sector of Ukraine, together with the nuclear energy. And when it was these territories were occupied, Ukraine has lost very important deposits of coal, and also had to change their energy strategy as for the heating in Ukraine. Here you could see on the map the different deposits in Ukraine, and as I mentioned before, very rich it is in eastern Ukraine, and that's why today we say that invasion on Ukraine was it is a proxy war between Russia and the USA, but I think that it is also war about the rich deposits which possess Ukraine, because this deposit European Union could use together with Ukraine for development, for mutual cooperation in the field of energy security. And Russian Federation is not interested to for Ukraine to become strong country and to strengthen with its deposits European Union. In general, all the region of Ukraine we can divide into three parts: western, eastern, and also southern part, where we have Crimea, Sea Azov, Black Sea, because this region is also very rich in different resources. Also, as for production and consumption, for example, fossil fuels, here you could see from the time of independence, the consumption of Ukraine was very high because industry of Ukraine was high intensive, and step by step Ukraine decreased the consumption. It was caused by the closing some enterprises and also by changes in the energy policy of Ukraine. As for shale gas, as I mentioned, Ukraine has three big deposits, one in the east, one in the west, and one in the south. And as I mentioned, in the east and in the west, there were signed agreement, Royal Dutch Shell, Chevron, and they withdraw because of the armed conflicts in Donbass and drop European gas prices. Also in the south there is a Scythian bloc, and there also there is a consortium, but today because of annexation of Crimea the exploitation of this deposit is not possible. Ukraine is also rich in underground gas storages, and these storages could be used not only by Ukraine but some European countries which doesn't possess, for example, underground gas storages, and also very important that most of these underground gas storages are found in the western part of Ukraine, close to the border with Poland. Gas system, it is also very interesting because Ukraine was one of the greatest transit countries in Europe in the terms of Russian gas, and even when the war started, Ukrainian gas transit system was working because until the 1st of January 2025, Moldova, Hungary and Slovakia got Russian gas through the Ukrainian system. At the beginning of this year, Ukraine didn't continue the agreement, so all the transit through the territory of Ukraine was stopped. Coal sector, and here you could see, and as I mentioned, that most of the coal mines are in the eastern part of Ukraine, and most of these mines are under the occupation. Many of them were occupied in 2014, and today also very so many mines are also under the occupation. Also, like with gas, coal, also production and consumption at the beginning of the independence of Ukraine was very high. Today you could see that Ukraine step by step reducing the consumption of the coal, yes, and try to change coal to coal on gas, and in the future Ukraine planned it also to replaced by renewable energy sources. As for oil, the same situation, so I will not pay more attention to it. And also about the refining capacities. Ukraine had 6 refineries, and on the day of the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it was working only one. Today, no one is working. Some of them were closed before the war, and some of them were destroyed during the war. That's why the refinery sector in Ukraine today, we can say, doesn't work. So as for renewable energy sources, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, Ukraine is developing it very intensively, especially last year. Until this time, dominate hydro power because Ukraine has a big river. So, and this sector was built during Soviet times, and during the times of independence, it was reconstructed. And here you could see, for example, how many different kinds of energy power are under the occupation, and how it looked like on the date of 2024. So we could see that, for example, the largest nuclear power plant, Zaporizhzhia power plant, is under the occupation. It was one of the most important plants because it is delivered the electricity all over the Ukraine. Also, you could see that wind power stations which were built before the full-scale invasion, most of them are under the occupation, and the same, for example, also with thermal power plants. Most of them were in the eastern Ukraine because there was well-developed industry, so this region need more electricity, more power, so many of these power plants are under occupation and some of them are destroyed. So as for renewable energy sources, you could see that Ukraine developed different kind of renewables, and especially these renewables were developing in the south and in the east, and many of these territories are under the occupation. Here I also in short show you, for example, how much capacities are under the occupation and how many were destroyed. So the same with the wind energy. So most which is in the south of Ukraine, it is under the occupation. So it is a very big percent, about 80%. As for bioenergy, here this kind of energy is dispersed all over the territory of Ukraine. So you could see that not only some regions are under the occupation. Transmission network, so Ukraine, after the starting of full-scale invasion, must repair non-stop this transmission network because they are main purpose of the shellings from the drones and rockets from Russian Federation. And one of the very important things which had happened at the first day of the war, it's that Ukraine disconnected from the grid with Russia and Belarus and synchronized her work with European Union. So it was very important because Ukraine avoid energy collapse, which could happen, especially in the first day of the war. So as for Ukraine electricity mix, dominate nuclear power. We also have thermal power plants. Some of them were destroyed when the war started, and also after the annexation of Crimea, Ukraine had to modernize some of them because they were working on the hard coal, and because mines of hard coal were occupied, so Ukraine had to change the resources, and they modernized them on the gas power plants. And also you see that renewables and hydropower are also present in the electricity mix in Ukraine. So in the terms of different resources, you could see that dominate nuclear energy. There is some decrease of coal, grow the importance of gas and hydroelectric power, and also renewable energy sources. And as for nuclear power plants, as I mentioned, the greatest plant, it's a Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. It is under the occupation, but Ukraine also has other power plants. It's South Ukrainian, Khmelnytsky and Rivne. Also, everybody knows about Chernobyl. Chernobyl at the beginning of the war was occupied, so it was very strange and difficult situation because everybody remember what is Chernobyl, and this zone was forbidden to visit and so on. As for nuclear generation, you could see that when the war started, also the generation of electricity decreased because some enterprises stopped. People also left their places or were replaced from their houses because of the war. Some enterprises and some houses, some cities were destroyed. That's why the consumption is much smaller. As for critical minerals, Ukraine has about 20,000 natural deposits spanning about 116 types. And before full-scale invasion on Ukraine, about 15% of these deposits, including metallic and non-metallic, were actively exploited. And as for these critical minerals, when we look at the list of the minerals of European Union, and when we look at the minerals which Ukraine possesses on its territory, you could see that many of them are really critical and are really important. So they are dispersed all over the territory. The most important is titanium. Ukraine has 7 global deposits in the world, and the largest in Europe. Also lithium, which is very interesting. President Donald Trump. Also other resources. So that's why we can understand why United States are so much interested in these critical minerals, because today United States are so much dependent from the critical minerals from China, and Ukraine, it is a possibility to diversify their resources. And as for graphite, Ukraine is possess 20% of global resources, and in Europe, only Austria, Germany, and Norway has much smaller resources. And here is list. I will not pay attention on it. It is easy to find and to check which resources are important for European Union. And on the last, some scenarios for the European Union. Optimistic it is, of course, then the war will stop and Ukraine and the European Union will cooperate in the field of energy security, in the field of raw materials, critical materials, reducing dependence on China and Russia. Will be created new jobs, new enterprises. Yes, will be created full cycle of production on territory of Ukraine, about which is very interested President Zelensky. Realistic that Ukraine will sign some agreement that the European Union will diversify its supply resources, but still will rely on some external resources, for example, on China. And pessimistic scenario, it is, of course, if war will continue, Ukraine will not be able to become a significant supply of critical minerals to European Union. The dependence from the China will be very high, and the Ukrainian economy and European economy will depend on the resources external, for example, China and or Russian Federation. So as for the scenarios for Ukraine, there is conservative, liberal, and revolutionary when we talk about the general energy potential of Ukraine and energy sector. So pessimistic that everything will like was before the war, the coal and other fossil fuel will dominate in the energy sector of Ukraine. Liberal that coal-fired thermal power generation will be change on the gas power plants, and that very important role will be of the nuclear power stations. And the revolutionary scenario, of course, take into consideration development of the renewable energy sources, but decreasing of the nuclear power station. I think that this scenario was written before the full-scale invasion, but when we look critical eye today, how Ukraine could develop its energy sector, I think that they will pay attention for renewables and for nuclear power, because a lot of enterprises were destroyed and they need so much financial and investments, so Ukraine will not be able to do it in a short time. So that's why they will try to develop something that they possess on their territory. And I think that all, if you have any questions, I will be glad to answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oksana, for such a comprehensive rundown of the impact on the war of Ukraine that we've seen from the Russian invasion. Certainly, I know in the international sphere, it's had a massive impact, and we've seen the entire redistribution of the European synchronous centralized grid. So it's had a massive shift, and we've even seen this feeding through most recently to the Balkans as well, as they've redistributed their power networks there. So thank you so much for the insights. I'll be sure to pick your brains subsequent to this in our Q&A session as well. Our final speaker now is Natalie Jones. Natalie is a policy advisor at the International Institute of Sustainable Development's Energy Programme. Her work focuses on managed phase-out of oil and gas production in line with the Paris Agreement goals, including via international public finance. Before joining the Institute, Natalie carried out postdoctoral research at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, where she's remained a research affiliate. She's also worked with the Stockholm Environmental Institute, IISD's Earth Negotiations Bulletin, the Inter-American Association for Environmental Defence, the All-Party Parliamentary Groups for Future Generations. So we're getting a massive wealth of experience here today, as well as with various youth campaign organisations, and as a judge's clerk for the High Court of New Zealand. So Natalie, thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you for having me. Let me just share my screen quickly. Right, hopefully this should be working. Can someone give me a nod? Perfect. Yes. Okay. Well, today I'm going to speak about what happened at COP29 on fossil fuels specifically. Although, as we've heard, COP29 was not known as an energy COP, it was much more of a finance COP. There were nonetheless some interesting things that happened, so I'm going to go through those. But first, a bit of background on why I'm focusing on fossil fuels in particular. It doesn't appear in the Paris Agreement, despite the fact that the combustion of fossil fuels makes up 86% of carbon dioxide emissions. And for several years, there has been what, if you're polite, you might call a conversation, and if you're not polite, you might call a fight on how to get the phase out of fossil fuels into the debate at COP. And this has happened over several years. So what we saw at COP26, there was an agreement regarding a call on parties to basically accelerate efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. This was repeated at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. And so this was really the first time that there was really any substantive mention of the major cause of the climate problem in a COP agreement. So it's a bit unbelievable that it took 26 COPs to get there, but this was the agreement regarding coal and fossil fuel subsidies. But then what happened basically was that back at COP26, India had the floor in the final moments of the plenary and kind of said, look, this isn't good enough. The original language was a phase out of unabated coal power, and they said, no, it has to be phased down. And then what happened the next year at COP27 was, again, India were like, if we're going to talk about coal, we need to talk about all the fossil fuels. And once they said that, basically everyone jumped on that. And there was a massive push to get some kind of agreement that that was regarding all kinds of fossil fuels, not just coal, so also including oil and gas. That was not successful at COP27, but in the year leading up to COP28, there was this massive sense of kind of a momentum building, and yeah, just lots of very interesting work happening on that. So then what we saw at COP28 and what was called the UAE consensus, the outcome, it called on parties to contribute to a series of global efforts, and including in this, we saw the tripling of renewable energy capacity and doubling the global average annual rate of energy efficiency improvements by 2030. We had a repetition of this language regarding phase down of unabated coal power. And then the key paragraph for me was 28D, which was transitioning away from fossil fuels and energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner, accelerating action in this critical decade so as to achieve net zero by 2050 in keeping with the science. And then it also had a paragraph on fossil fuel subsidies, so trying to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that do not address energy poverty or just transitions as soon as possible. This was really a landmark. It was very exciting. Everyone thought, well, not everyone, but a lot of people thought, okay, this is great. We now have an agreement regarding all fossil fuels. Although it was not potentially the strongest language we could have had, that language might have looked like phase out of all transitioning away, which arguably is a bit weaker, but nonetheless, it's definitely a hook that you can hang your hat on, so to speak. And we've already seen how this can be very powerful. For example, in the International Court of Justice advisory opinion that will be coming out soon, a lot of the states in their arguments referred specifically to this paragraph and says, look, we've now got an international agreement on the transition away from fossil fuels, so the court should kind of roll along these lines as well. That's just one example of how this paragraph has been powerful so far. So then at COP29, the question was, how do we follow this up? Now, you may think that it would be an uphill battle, and I think you'd be right for several reasons, some of which are showcased on this slide. For a start, there were over 1,700 fossil fuel lobbyists who were granted access to COP last year. That outnumbered the delegations of almost every country. There were some questionable actions from the presidency in the Azerbaijani president's opening speech at COP. He lauded fossil fuels and attacked the West for being hypocritical regarding their use of fossil fuels, which was rather an unorthodox approach to COP diplomacy, if I may say so. They were also filmed promoting oil and gas deals when they were meant to be kind of acting more neutrally in their role as COP host. And then there were the kind of special access that it was alleged was given to countries like Saudi Arabia, where they made changes to a document that normally shouldn't have been editable. So, you know, this was definitely a challenging environment to kind of expect any tangible advances on the transition away from fossil fuels, but nonetheless, a lot of people were there to try. And so on this next slide, here's some of the proposals that were put forward and actually included in the draft text. I think this is quite important to point out, because when you think of COP29, you often think about the 1.3 trillion, the 300 billion, or the finance things, and I really don't think as much attention was given to all these kind of draft pieces of text on fossil fuels and energy. I won't go through all of these, but For example, it was everything from a simple reaffirmation on the call to parties on transitioning away from fossil fuels. There were new targets for enhancing global energy storage and grid capacity. There was an idea for an annual report on global progress towards implementation of paragraph 28. That may sound like, oh, an annual report, like quite procedural, but this kind of stuff is how these commitments get really institutionalized in the process, and how they can be how we can create accountability and follow up. It's one thing to have a commitment, a simple statement, but then it's another thing to actually implement that and hold countries accountable, and kind of annual reporting is one of the tools for how we can do that. There was a proposal that the so-called UAE dialogue, which is one of the mechanisms to basically implement the outcomes of the global stocktake. There was a proposal that it include specifically a consideration of the energy transition and action aimed at and support for the transition away from fossil fuels. Again, it's one of those things that kind of sounds a bit like, okay, so we're going to like include it in this dialogue, but what does that really mean? But again, this is part of how it gets institutionalized, how we can track it, how we can promote accountability for it. Moving a bit further down, under the item on the new collective quantified goal, there was a call to reduce investment flows into fossil fuel infrastructure, very important. Something that noted the need to develop a polluter pays principle instrument targeted at the fossil fuel sector, a stipulation that to counter climate finance, the finance can't actually go towards fossil fuels, which would seem to me to be the basic criterion for climate finance. An agreement to phase out not only fossil fuel subsidies, but also public financing for fossil fuels, and a couple of other things. So, interactive time, question time. Can you raise your hand? How many of these do you think were adopted? Can you raise your hand if you think all of them were adopted? I'll open up the thing and... Okay, so I'm not seeing any hands. Can you raise your hand if you think maybe half of these were adopted? Okay, still not seeing any hands. Okay, what about, do you think maybe 2 or 3 of these were adopted? Raise your hand if you think maybe 2 or 3. Okay, I'm seeing a couple of hands. 3 hands. 4 hands, 5 hands. Okay. Raise your hand if you think none of these were adopted. I'm not seeing any hands. Okay, some people haven't raised their hands at all, but that's fine. That's fine. You don't have to. So big reveal, 0 of these were adopted. So what we saw basically was a really concerted attempt by opponents of the clean energy transition to ensure that there was absolutely no advance on what had happened at COP28. I think, yeah, I'm going to go to this slide first because even though it says conclusion, there are actually some things I want to say before I look ahead to COP30. But yeah, what we saw was that texts were continually watered down over the course of the COP. A lot of these proposals that I talked about, they kind of started off in the texts. Maybe in the 2nd or 3rd version, they were still there, but by the 4th or the 5th version, the final days of COP, they were being taken out. This was maybe inevitable given all of the kind of public attention was on finance, all the kind of pressure was on finance, and also maybe it was inevitable given the weak finance outcome. I mean, COPs, it's maybe too crude to say that COPs are all about a trade-off between mitigation and finance, but at the same time, there's maybe some truth in that. The final thing to say is that a key decision on this UAE dialogue on implementing the global stocktake outcomes was not adopted in the end. It was pushed to next year, which is this year now, 2025, that was the text that had a lot of these potential outcomes on fossil fuels in it. What we saw in the last iteration of that was a very, very, very weak text. So the question is no deal better than a bad deal? Personally, I would say, yeah, perhaps that's right. Perhaps no deal is better than a very weak deal there. But we'll see, we'll see this year if we can get any improvements on what would have definitely been a very bad deal at COP29. So looking ahead to COP30, there is a need to meaningfully have a follow-up on transitioning away from fossil fuels. As it stands, it is kind of this commitment that just kind of exists on its own in the ether. It doesn't have any implementation mechanisms tied to it. It doesn't have any accountability mechanisms tied to it. And there are ways that that could happen. There are also a couple of opportunities this year to hook in related text on fossil fuels. So one of them is the talks under Article 2.1c, which is the provision of the Paris Agreement on aligning flows of finance with low carbon development pathways. So basically aligning the financial flows with the other goals of the Paris Agreement. So these talks are set to wrap up. There's been a dialogue going on for the last 2 years on this. And there'll be a big report and a big decision. So this is an opportunity to firstly improve the agreement on ending fossil fuel subsidies, for example, by removing the language inefficient, and also to agree to end public support, other kinds of public support that are not subsidies for fossil fuels. Then there's the Baku to Belém roadmap that was mentioned earlier. That's also going to wrap up at COP30. And if we look at the scale of the fossil fuel subsidies, for example, that exist around the world, these are in the order of 1 trillion. So there's a huge opportunity here to show how the reform of these subsidies can contribute to the 1.3 trillion in climate needs for finance. So that's 2 sort of entry points that I see. Then the third one is that the next round of national climate plans, NDCs, nationally determined contributions, will be in by COP, hopefully, allowing for an assessment of to what extent their fossil fuel production plans align with the Paris Agreement goals. So I've done some analyses of the previous rounds of NDCs and actually found that of the kind of top producers of fossil fuels, a lot more of them actually explicitly say in their NDCs that they're going to continue or even expand their production of fossil fuels rather than decline their production in a managed way in line with Paris Agreement goals. So it'll be interesting to do that analysis again and see how much this global stocktake agreement on transitioning away from fossil fuels has kind of trickled down into the NDCs as you might expect that it would. Some NDCs are already in. Brazil's NDC is quite interesting. It says that the country is interested in targets and timelines for the transition away from fossil fuels, with developed countries taking the lead. So it remains to be seen how they intend to action this. Will they use their COP presidency to start some kind of initiative on defining targets and timelines for transitioning away from fossil fuel production, especially? That would be quite interesting. It's worth noting, though, that as a country, they are expanding their own fossil fuel production. So this may be a play to deflect attention from themselves, essentially. But we'll see. Yeah, so that is all I have to say. Very happy to take any questions, and thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Natalie. And thank you for such the comprehensive breakdown as well. It was really evident to see out at COP29 that the amount of focus that we gave to energy was really limited. We only saw very few points on the global energy storage and grids, the green energy zones, the hydrogen declaration. These points were really minimal on comparison to what we saw at COP28 itself. So I really appreciate the insights of that. We'll now be moving on to the Q&A platform segment of this event. So we invite all participants to post your questions into the chat here. But I think I will just quickly kick things off with a general question to everyone here. So we've sort of seen the impacts that COP28 and COP29 has had. Looking ahead to COP30, is there any specific aspects you think that we can adopt to accelerate just energy transitions, especially for oil and gas dependent economies, like that we saw the contradiction that was having COP29 hosted in Azerbaijan, a predominantly oil and gas field itself, oil and gas state. So is there anything that we are thinking ahead to COP30 that we can do to accelerate the action that we've seen at 28 and 29 itself? Please feel free, any of the speakers, feel free to unmute and answer. I know it's a really open-ended, generalized question, but yeah, if there's any insights or approaches that you're seeing.
I can jump in if that's okay. Yeah, so when I'm looking ahead to COP30, just to expand on kind of what I said in my presentation, I think the NDCs are going to be really crucial because the NDCs are essentially how each country is meant to translate the outcomes of the global stocktake into their own national policies. That's not just regarding energy, that's regarding everything: adaptation, resilience, other areas of mitigation. And there's actually a workshop going on at the same time as this one, which is run by the NDC Partnership, and are hosting the Secretary General's office, who are talking about how exactly this, how the global stocktake outcome can be translated into NDCs regarding transitioning away from fossil fuels, particularly oil and gas. So there's a really active conversation going on about how, like what NDCs can do, what NDCs can look like, that can help the transition on the energy transition. There's also a big conversation happening on the clean side, what NDCs should be including regarding targets for renewables, etc., grids, storage, etc. So yeah, these NDCs are really crucial. And then the other aspect is this Baku to Berlin roadmap. It's kind of trite to say that the finance is the enabler of all the action that we see internationally, but it's also kind of true. Like the more that we can see a real proper accounting of where this 1.3 trillion is going to come from, I think the more action we will see on the energy transition. I'll stop there.
That's great. No, I mean, I completely agree with it, Krishna.
Yeah, happy to jump in and also pick up what Natalie has said. I completely agree that NDC is the way forward, but also would be happy to hear more, maybe Natalie, about the conditionality of having those ambitions fulfilled, because in the past cycle we've seen that most countries would say have ambitious targets, but then tell us only that they would be able to meet those targets if they have the finance coming in. So that was a major hurdle. Yeah. So I'm not sure how this is being navigated about the conditionality aspect in terms of those targets. But another thing I would say is mostly when we are talking about the dependency of certain economies on fossil fuels, right? Especially the global south. And we are pushing for a transition, but then the global south, sometimes they are not ready to close down the main sector and so on. So that's something that sometimes are not talked about in the room, but some group of negotiators might be playing the game and be very wary about how they want this conversation to be put forward, right, about energy transition. So yeah, and yeah, we've all seen the reaction of some COP presidencies over fossil fuel as well, both from COP28 and COP29. That's mainly we understand why they were saying these, but also how to bring them on board, how to get the support. I think COP30 president has a big role to play, especially because they have been the leaders. They've chaired G20 recently and so on, so they might have more advocacy influence. So I would say it's the right time to strike if we want to bring hot topics on the table at this point. Yeah.
Certainly. No, I absolutely agree. And I think one of the key factors we need to factor in this year as well will be how we can begin to de-risk finance as well, because it's all well and good sort of proposing all of these wonderful ideas, but ultimately, if we're not seeing private sector uptake as well, especially when we're implementing these projects in the global south, it's going to be really hard to ensure longevity and long-term impact as we begin to roll out these initiatives. I think I'll quickly ask one more question of the panel. As we've sort of seen at COP as well, often too many cooks spoil the broth. So there's so many ideas and initiatives happening simultaneously. So reflecting on the year that we've just had, sort of externally, we saw that previous year was the hottest year on record, and it's undeniable that there's an increasing number of climate disasters occurring. We've already crossed so many of the global planetary tipping points itself. It's just a crazy number to think on. So looking ahead to COP30 as well, is there anything that you think we should be prioritizing? What's one or two key priorities that you believe we as a global community should be focusing on to strengthen global commitments on climate adaptation and resilience for vulnerable nations, thinking about SIDS and those in the global south itself?
Yeah, happy to jump in. Not talking mostly on technical side, but also on how advocacy and inclusion has been in this space so far, right? And I think that COP30 has a big opportunity because most of the narrative is also about indigenous people. If you've read articles recurrently about COP30, they are mentioning indigenous people, local communities, and so on. And I hope that this would be truly reflected on ground and also throughout the year when the consultations are happening, when technical meetings are happening, etc. And it also, I think COP30 also has a big opportunity on how a different group of negotiators would be able to position themselves, especially, as I mentioned, Brazil has had a big role recently in G20 and also is an important task force. So they can have a big win when it comes to inclusion and advocacy and the voice of the global south and how this is navigated through negotiations, because the presidency play a big role when it comes to negotiations and how they want to channel those conversations and so on, right? I think this should be leveraged on for this year.
Certainly. Anyone else on the panel? Any insights? One or two kind of priorities that you think this should be the goal? Is it the integration of COP28, COP29, the accountability aspect that Natalie was mentioning earlier? Is there any learnings that we can sort of see from the Ukraine situation as well, and sort of enhancing levels of energy security? Should these be levels of priorities, do we think, or is it more of a holistic approach?
As for Ukraine, I think that Ukraine will be very interesting in the very good decision about the climate problems, because we 2 years ago, when was Kakhovka Dam destroyed, we had a big natural disaster, and that's why today in Ukraine, especially in the wartime, yes, climate has a very important role, and because almost eastern Ukraine is destroyed, and it also has influence not only on the ecology but on the life, animals, people, and so on. And I think that Ukraine will be very active in these different initiatives concerning the climate changes, ecology, and energy security.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, I think as well, factoring in the ecological aspects of things will be really important, not least with the location and positioning of this COP this year happening in sort of one of the final few sort of remaining rainforests that we've got in the world. So, no, I absolutely agree with that point. Unfortunately, we're now out of time of the Q&A segment, but I would just like to quickly pass over to the Beyond COP team to say a few words before we close the session. And I would like to personally thank all the speakers here today for your incredible insights as well. So, Hannah, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Josh. I'd just like to again say thank you so much to our speakers, Matthew, Karishma, and Oksana again, for joining us today. And also, of course, to you, Josh, our wonderful moderator today. And we've heard that there is a lot that we need to be doing and a lot that we need to learn, both as individuals, as communities, and of course, we need to push for action from the government as well. And while we need to also acknowledge our own efforts so far, it's also critical that we get involved in whatever way that we can, whatever capacity that we can, and the good start is joining in this conversation. So I'm very grateful that we have had this conversation today. And I'll pass on to you, Bianca.
Thank you. So many of us might be thinking, what do we do next? Following on from this event, we're going to be collating all of the responses, and the presentations and the questions in the report, and then considering our action points. Those that we can implement, we're going to promise to do, and those that might be more long-term or abstract, we're going to brainstorm. A recording of this event will be published on YouTube and then shared amongst our networks, along with a finalized report of everything. So we'll keep you all updated. As we close, could I please ask the speakers to stay behind just for a minute if you have the time? But yeah, finally, I want to say thank you all again for attending the event, Beyond COP29, Powering Our Future. And I hope you have a really good morning, afternoon, and evening. Thank you.